A massive liner set sail across the Atlantic, being one of the fastest and most luxurious vessels of its time. It accommodates nearly 2,000 passengers, from those traveling in third class to prominent figures from American and European elite. For most of them, this journey will be their last. This giant liner, deemed unsinkable, will plunge into the ocean, taking with it over 1,000 lives. The events take place in the mid-1910s of the 20th century, and although the story of this incident intersects with the tragedy of the Titanic, not everyone is familiar with it, perhaps due to the unfortunate fate of the first ship. The sinking of the Lusitania is no less dramatic, and in some aspects even surpasses the well-known story captured in the famous Hollywood film. Unlike the passengers of the Titanic, who were unaware of the impending danger, some people on board the Lusitania knew that risk awaited them. The tragedy of the Titanic occurred in 1912 and became a disaster of global proportions, leading to a re-evaluation of various safety measures on ships. However, just 3 years later, the tragedy of the Lusitania unfolded, with the death toll exceeding 1,000, many of whom remained missing. Although there were enough lifeboats on board and the ship had successfully completed 200 crossings of the Atlantic, the icy threats that loomed over it were avoided. So what really happened? This is the story of the sinking of the Lusitania. If you are not familiar with the tragedy of the Lusitania, this video will be an intriguing revelation for you. Even if you have general knowledge about the incident, you will be curious to learn many rarely mentioned details that give this story a true epic quality. The name Titanic appears frequently in the introduction, and indeed there is a significant similarity between the two disasters. However, as we delve into the details, you will see that these are completely different stories. But more on that later. Let's start from the beginning. The end of April 1915. In the port of New York, a massive ship is meticulously prepared for its next transatlantic voyage. Hundreds of staff on board are diligently working, cleaning cabins, making beds, checking ventilation, and stocking the holds with food, alcohol, and cigars to ensure leisure for the most demanding passengers during the week-long journey. The Lusitania is renowned for its speed. The journey to British Liverpool takes only 7 days, making it the fastest passenger ship in the world at that time. However, high speed comes at a cost. The ship burns about 1,000 tons of coal per day, not only for its powerful turbines and engines, but also to operate other systems, including elevators and 6,000 electric light bulbs. However, British Q-Art does not limit itself to comfort and speed. After the Titanic disaster, the competing companies suffered enormous losses. The tragedy claimed nearly 1,000 lives and led to stricter safety regulations in maritime transport. On board the Lusitania, there were enough lifeboats and life jackets for each of the nearly 300 passengers and 700 crew members to feel safe. At that time, the company's reputation was impeccable. There had been no passenger fatalities due to its fault. Accidents on voyages certainly occurred, but they generally happened for natural reasons and involved elderly passengers. On the day of departure, May 3rd, 1915, the liner Lusitania was preparing for its 202nd transatlantic voyage without any serious incidents in 8 years of operation. Every large ship requires an experienced captain. In the company, William Turner, 58, was considered the best specialist in managing ocean liners. 5 years ago, he set a record for speed in transatlantic crossing on the neighboring ship to the Lusitania. Turner had risen from a cabin boy to captain of major passenger vessels. Along the way, he encountered a few minor incidents, but such occurrences had not spared any experienced captain. An interesting testament to the reputation of the captain of the Lusitania is the fact that just a few days before the final voyage, William Turner testified in court. Relatives of American victims of the Titanic were attempting to claim substantial compensation from the White Star Line, and the plaintiff's lawyers invited Turner as an expert witness. He had altered the route after reports of icebergs and noted in court that the captain of the Titanic had made a mistake by deciding to pass through that area at high speed. Thus, the passengers of the Lusitania, both elite representatives and more modest individuals, could confidently rely on their captain and his ship. Among the nearly 1,300 passengers on board the Lusitania, the majority were British, over 900, and around 200 were Americans. In New York, the main event of the day was the departure of this liner, which generated significant interest both due to the grandeur of the ships themselves and the status of the first-class travelers. Alfred is also known as a member of an elite circle of fortunate individuals. Together with J.P. Morgan, Theodore Dreiser, and other prominent figures, he decided at the last moment to forego the voyage on the Titanic. Ultimately, he rented one of the most luxurious cabins on the Lusitania, costing several tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. On board the Lusitania, one can find numerous celebrities, including one of the most famous writers of the time, Elbert Hubbard, who is traveling with his wife. Also accompanying them is wealthy developer Orden Hamont. Criminally charged for the book collector Charles Lariat, there was also business. He was transporting a rare edition of Dickens' works and several valuable illustrations to London. Passengers of all classes included many families with children. At the time of departure on May 1st, there were around 100 young passengers on board. On the eve of departure, several dozen passengers from the canceled Cameroon voyage were transferred to the Lusitania. Most of the newcomers were pleased with the new opportunity, as the Lusitania is a luxurious vessel where everything, from the cabins to the public spaces and menu, exceeds the standard of most passenger ships. After a slight delay related to boarding additional passengers, the liner finally sets off on its journey. Passengers wave warmly to the camera and people on the shore, creating a festive atmosphere, crowned by the smoke billowing from the liner's enormous funnels. However, the mood of some passengers is dampened by an announcement in the newspaper. The German embassy in the United States has issued a warning advertisement stating that Germany has declared the area around the British Isles a war zone, and all ships flying the flags of Britain and its allies may be subject to attack. For nearly a year, a large-scale war had been ongoing in Europe. In the summer of 1914, the continent was living a peaceful life, and newspapers published social chronicles about the vacation plans of royal families and aristocrats. Everyone believed that war would not occur. Nevertheless, the underpinnings of the crisis had been building for years. Conflicts of interest in various corners of Europe, strained relations, and an arms race between Britain and Germany. Many ordinary citizens and even high-ranking officials among the world powers naively believed that a real confrontation would not come to pass, thinking that the economic and cultural ties between nations were too strong to allow for a major war. However, history had a different opinion. At the end of June 1914, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, marking the formal beginning of the World War that no one yet referred to as the First. The history of World War I can be studied for hours, but it is important to grasp a few key points. The war was already in full swing, affecting numerous countries. Among the main adversaries were Germany and Britain, while the United States maintained neutrality. Thus, the passenger liner Lusitania was departing from a peaceful country to a war zone. Passengers on the Lusitania were not surprised by the situation. Although they felt a certain level of concern, it was more of a mild unease. This is evidenced by the fact that the liner was nearly full, with only a few cabins available in first class. The war had been ongoing for a long time, and passenger ships continued to operate regularly between Britain and the United States. However, a new serious threat had emerged in British waters: submarines. Prior to the outbreak of World War I, this threat was not taken seriously, and everyone hoped for the protection of ships. But over time, perceptions of the capabilities of submarines began to change. Submarines were in service with both the British and the Germans. Germany recognized their true potential by sinking several British warships at the beginning of the war. These stationary submarines allowed for attacks not only on enemy military vessels, but also on cargo ships, which posed a serious threat to Britain as an island nation. This created significant problems, as many essential resources, including food and armaments, were delivered to the country by sea. Although such actions were brutal and inhumane, they proved to be quite logical in the context of war. British submarines were also active, but unlike the Germans, who often targeted cargo ships, the British primarily focused on intercepting them. The threat to the passengers of the Lusitania was evident, as the Germans threatened both military and civilian vessels that could be repurposed for transporting military cargo. Nevertheless, only a few individuals chose to forego boarding the ship after reading the warning about submarines in the newspaper. This issue is quite intriguing and has several explanations. Firstly, there was an unwritten rule in the war that attacking civilian vessels was considered unacceptable. Initially, this rule also applied to merchant ships, but as the conflict progressed, the Germans quickly forgot it and began destroying cargo ships. Secondly, Germany was not eager to destroy vessels with American citizens on board, as this could lead to the United States abandoning its neutrality and adding another strong adversary to the list. To some extent, the British company that owned the liner was counting on this as well. Finally, it is difficult to determine what the submarines of that time were closer to: tin cans or modern submarines. We will examine their design in detail later, but for now, it is important to know that the liner Lusitania could reach speeds of up to 45 km/h, while the maximum speed of more modern submarines of that period was almost half that. This means that upon spotting a submarine, which was not particularly difficult to see, the ship could easily distance itself from it. Additionally, it had sufficient maneuverability to evade a fired torpedo. Overall, neither the company staff nor Captain Turner nor the passengers of the Lusitania had any reason for concern. Against the backdrop of reports about submarine attacks, reporters asked passengers questions. For instance, before departure, they asked Alfred Vanderbilt if he hoped for the same luck as with the Titanic. The heir simply smiled in response. Captain Turner, upon hearing the discussion, remarked that the idea of the Lusitania being attacked by a torpedo was the best joke he had ever heard. However, neither he nor Alfred Vanderbilt nor the other passengers or journalists suspected what was known only to a small group of British Secret Service staff who were intercepting messages from German military ships and submarines. A day before the departure of the Lusitania, on Friday, April 30th, a German submarine U-20 set out from a northwestern port in Germany. The submarine was commencing a routine operation in British waters with the primary goal of sinking as many Allied ships as possible. A frosty Sunday morning in the cold waters off the northern coast of Britain, a German submarine is heading towards the Isle of May. On the raised platform above the conning tower, Captain Walter Schweiger, 32 years old, stands in a cap and leather coat. The submarine is also known as Bat or U-boot, which translates from German to mean submarine. Although Schweiger is still young, he is already recognized as one of the most experienced submarine captains in Germany. He belongs to the select few who began their service on submarines even before the war started. By 1915, the German fleet had just over 24 submarines capable of undertaking long voyages. The U-boat is a large and rather imperfect machine. Although it is a submarine, it could not remain underwater for long. When submerged, the propulsion system operated on batteries, allowing the boat to cover no more than 150 kilometers at a speed of up to 15 kilometers per hour. On the surface, a diesel engine was used, which nearly doubled the speed. With such characteristics, U-boat captains could pursue ordinary cargo ships, but were completely incapable of dealing with fast liners like the Lusitania. The crew of the German submarine encountered numerous threats during their voyages, including British warships and traps made of metal nets. 6 months ago, Schweiger's vessel got caught in laid nets and was on the brink of disaster. In conditions of fog with limited visibility, the submarine risked colliding with another ship and sinking. An additional threat was the insufficient reliability of the submarine's construction. If something went wrong, the entire crew risked finding themselves at the bottom with no chance to surface, facing a lack of oxygen and a torturous death. Being inside the submarine for a 2-week voyage was a true trial. The main space of the 70-meter-long submarine was occupied by tanks for seawater, which were filled and emptied during dives and surfacing. The crew of 30 was confined in cramped quarters in the central part of the vessel. The air was heavy, and no one had the opportunity to wash. The crew had access to one toilet, which could malfunction and discharge its contents outside. The limited supply of fresh food spoiled quickly. Sailors primarily subsisted on canned goods and occasionally caught fish on the surface and cooked it inside, which only exacerbated the already foul odor. On board the submarine, the crew had a dog, and they celebrated the previous Christmas romantically by descending to the seabed. At a depth of 20 meters, no one could hear their loud songs. Accompanied by music, wine, and good food, they took strolls on the deck and engaged in social conversations. Thus began the first few days of the Lusitania's voyage. Most passengers on the Lusitania are aware of the brutal war in Central Europe. They have read news about the atrocities on the fronts in France, the tens of thousands of casualties, and the choking gas used by German troops. However, for many of them, the conflict seems like something distant. They relax, enjoying wine and dishes made from halibut, while only a few feel any anxiety. First-class passenger Dwight Harris is carrying an expensive engagement ring from New York. The day before departure, he read in the newspaper about submarines and managed to purchase a life preserver, which he brought with him on the liner. Captain William Turner tries to reassure the anxious passengers whose communication with him has become a true trial. His impressive naval career has come at a personal cost. His wife left him, taking several daughters with her. Therefore, when the captain asserts that the Lusitania is not in danger from a torpedo attack by a submarine, he says it sincerely and believes in his words. William Turner had already encountered submarines multiple times while commanding other liners, and in those instances, he readily relied on the speed of his vessels to successfully evade pursuit. The thought that the Germans would not attack a large passenger ship, especially with American citizens on board, also seemed logical. However, behind this theory lay several significant problems. First of all, on the day of the Lusitania's departure, a German submarine attacked an American cargo ship near the European shores, and among the victims were U.S. citizens. There was no sharp reaction from President Wilson, which meant that Germany had crossed a dangerous line once again. However, no one on the Lusitania, including the captain, was aware of the incident that had occurred. Secondly, the Germans had a formal pretext for attacking the liner. The Lusitania was carrying cargo related to military supplies intended for the production of rifles and other armaments for the Allies. This is linked to an interesting detail. Immediately after the Lusitania departed from New York, several German spies were discovered on board. German authorities often sent scouts onto passenger ships to ascertain the presence of military cargo. The spies were quickly apprehended and held in custody until the voyage was completed, so it is unlikely that the Germans were aware of the military cargo on the liner. The third, and perhaps most significant factor in underestimating the Germans' capabilities, was the captain of the submarine U-20, Walter Schwieger, a cold-blooded and ruthless man with the authority to destroy the enemy. On the sixth day of his patrol, Schwieger's luck was running out. His submarine was off the coast of Ireland and had yet to sink a single vessel, despite several unsuccessful attempts. In one instance, he was thwarted by British warships. In another, he failed to catch up with a Danish passenger liner. And on a third occasion, a torpedo misfired. Torpedoes are the primary weapon of submarines. On board the U-20, as on other boats of this type, there are only 7 torpedoes installed. These missiles are large, heavy, and expensive to produce, but they are indeed effective when they hit their target. The main problem is that in 60% of attack cases, a torpedo might fail to detonate or veer off course. Although the submarine had other types of munitions, their power was low, and they posed a threat only to small vessels. The captain of the German submarine was not interested in minor trophies. The success of his operations was determined by the tonnage of the ships he sank. The larger the cargo, the greater the effectiveness of his patrol. On the evening of May 5th, Schwieger, looking through the periscope, spots something resembling a cargo ship. His assistant identifies it as a British vessel transporting stones. Although the ship is relatively small, it is a welcome sight for the Germans after an unproductive patrol. Schwieger is cautious. He realizes that the periscope, protruding above the water surface, leaves a noticeable wake that can be seen from a distance. If the ship notices this in advance, it will likely escape from pursuit. The U-20 approaches the target at the appropriate distance. At that moment, the cargo ship spots the submarine and begins to maneuver sharply. Schwieger gives the command to open fire, but not with torpedoes, which he is saving for larger prey. Several shots hit the hull of the ship, causing an explosion, and it begins to sink. Captain Schwieger observes everything through the periscope, and for him, it is a silent spectacle. There are no audible explosions or screams inside the submarine. This also explains the cold-bloodedness of many German submarine commanders. Although some colleagues noted Schwieger's particular brutality, he once attacked a large ship displaying a red cross, which turned out to be a floating hospital. During the patrol, Walter Schwieger's actions were not monitored. Like other captains of large German submarines, he had complete authority over his vessel for most of the route. Communication with command was established only at the beginning of the voyage, approximately 100 kilometers from the point of departure. Beyond that, the captain independently decides whether to engage the enemy. A few hours after successfully firing at the cargo ship, Schwieger spots a new target, a Norwegian steamer. Although Norway is officially a neutral country, German captains know that British vessels sometimes use the flags of neutral states as a disguise. Walter Schwieger decides to attack the Norwegian steamer with a torpedo. When it is launched, the crew of the ship spots the incoming missile and quickly changes course, but it is already too late. At the last moment, the torpedo inexplicably veers off course and passes beneath the hull of the ship. Schwieger decides not to continue the attack, fearing that the Norwegian vessel might return fire. He gives the command to dive. The crews of both attacked ships report the spotted submarine and its coordinates to the British authorities, allowing them to determine the location and course of the U-20. According to calculations, the submarine is expected to reach the southern shores of Ireland around the same time as the large passenger liner Lusitania, which is approaching British shores and is expected to arrive in Liverpool with a slight delay. The liner is moving slower than usual due to the war. The Cunard Company is forced to conserve resources, and only 3 boilers are operating on board instead of 4. As a result, some passengers notice that no smoke is coming from one of the funnels. William Turner receives information about the activities of the German submarine, but at that moment, the British Admiralty is more focused on the fate of one of its large warships operating in the region. Meanwhile, British intelligence intercepts numerous encrypted messages from the German armed forces, including messages from submarines. Although the British have a document with codes for decryption, they prefer not to disclose its existence and decide to share the information obtained only in extreme cases. The safety of the Lusitania is not considered a priority at this time. There is another conspiracy theory. It would have been quite beneficial for the British in 1915 if the United States had entered the war on their side. An attack by a German submarine on a liner with Americans on board could have provided a serious basis for President Wilson to abandon neutrality. However, William Turner, although aware of the potential threat posed by German submarines in British waters, does not suspect that danger is so close. On Thursday, May 6th, the captain of the Lusitania conducts a check of the lifeboats. The crew shows the passengers how to board the boats in case of an emergency, and an order is given to prepare the lifeboats. One of the crew members, named Morton, is actively painting one of them. He is approached by 15-year-old Gwendolyn Allen, the daughter of a first-class passenger, who asks to take the brush to help. Morton allows her to paint the boat, fearing that she might stain her expensive dress and that he could face consequences. However, Gwendolyn manages the task neatly and eventually runs off. Thursday becomes the most successful day for Captain Walter Schwieger, who attacks 2 British cargo ships within a few hours. After this, he makes the difficult decision to end the patrol. Initially, he had planned to reach the waters near English Liverpool, where there are more potential targets. However, by that time, Schwieger has already consumed a significant amount of fuel, and it may not be enough for the return journey. The U-20 has only 3 torpedoes left in its arsenal, 2 of which must be reserved for the return trip according to regulations. In addition, a thick fog sets in on Thursday, presenting one of the most dangerous weather conditions for a submarine. Schwieger begins his journey back home. This is the last full day of the Lusitania at sea, and the ship is scheduled to arrive in Liverpool on Saturday. The night before, William Turner finally received a message from the British Admiralty. Given the coordinates of the recent U-20 attacks, the Lusitania could encounter a German submarine. Overcoming his introversion, Turner addressed the passengers and explained the potential threat posed by submarines, but reassured them that the liner was safe. He also requested that the portholes be closed and covered to reduce the visibility of the ship. That evening, the mood on board was clearly less festive. By the morning of May 7th, the fog had lifted and the day promised to be clear and sunny. William Turner receives a new message about the presence of German submarines in the area, but the information regarding their number and location is not specified. The captain does not receive any instructions to change course or make a brief stop at an Irish port, so he continues on his way to Liverpool. Passengers can see the shores of Ireland in the distance, and despite the captain's warning the day before, everyone is busy preparing for arrival. Dwayne Harris takes a valuable ring out of the safe and hides it in the inner pocket of his suit, while Charles Lariah places a precious illustrated book into his briefcase. During lunch, one of the passengers jokes that it would be a real crime if a German submarine prevented him from enjoying dessert. Around 2 p.m., Captain Schwieger spots a large passenger liner and is greatly surprised that the ship is moving without escort, considering the activity of the U-20 in the area the day before. The ship is too far away, and Schwieger believes that an attack on the vessel will not be possible unless the liner changes course. In response to warnings about submarines, Captain William Turner decides to slightly adjust the route and reduces speed. Noticing that the passenger liner is now on a collision course, Schwieger gives the order to prepare a torpedo. At 2:10 p.m., the torpedo leaves the submarine and heads towards the Lusitania, with just over 30 seconds remaining until impact. The remaining half-minute becomes an eternity for many passengers and crew members of the Lusitania. Many of them notice the approaching torpedo, which can be tracked underwater in clear weather and calm seas. The torpedo emits a faint glow, and for a moment, the passengers lose sight of it, believing it has passed by. In the next moment, a powerful explosion occurs, causing one of the nearby lifeboats to be blown to pieces. A hole the size of a small house opens up at the bottom of the ship underwater. It immediately becomes clear that all crew members nearby in the internal compartments are either dead or very close to it. Due to the low speed of the liner, water quickly fills the ship through the newly formed opening, approximately 100 tons per second. All passengers in their cabins and on deck freeze in place. Captain Turner descends from the bridge to assess the damage when, 30 seconds later, another powerful explosion occurs. Due to the rapid unfolding of events, many passengers do not understand what is happening, especially those in first class who are higher up and farther from the epicenter of the explosion. They only feel slight jolts, and some continue to eat and smoke cigars. However, some first-class passengers begin to realize the seriousness of the situation. At that moment, Charles Lariah is next to the writer Hubbard and his wife. He tells the couple that they need to hurry for life vests, but they remain cautious and do not react, frozen in confusion. Passengers in second and third class begin to panic. Many grab life vests and quickly run up the stairs. Second-class passenger Nora Brederton finds herself in a difficult situation. She was traveling alone with her 3-year-old son and 1.5-year-old daughter. At the moment of the explosion, her daughter was in the nursery on the upper deck, while her son was sleeping in the second-class cabin a little lower down. In a panic, Nora tries to decide which child to run to first. Ultimately, she decides to go up for her daughter first. Captain Turner tries to take emergency measures. He orders the ship to stop in order to lower the lifeboats, but the vessel does not respond. Then the captain decides to make a sharp turn and head towards the nearest Irish shore. However, the liner begins to move away from land instead. In this situation, Turner orders the watertight doors inside to be closed to protect the ship from flooding. One of the passengers on the Lusitania is a professional shipbuilder who tries to reassure another passenger, insisting that the torpedo is not dangerous and cannot sink the liner. However, seeing the dishes sliding off the table due to the tilt, he suddenly stands up and puts on a life vest. Just 10 minutes after the attack, all of the ship's systems fail, and the electricity goes out. Fortunately, unlike the Titanic, this occurs on a clear day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Turner sends a message to the Admiralty about the attack on the ship. Meanwhile, water quickly floods the vessel through the newly formed opening and open hatches, and real panic begins. Passengers notice that the bow of the ship has significantly tilted downward and do not understand why the order to lower the lifeboats has not been given. However, it is technically impossible to do so. The liner continues to move, and due to the tilt on one side, The lifeboats either hang too high for boarding or are pressed tightly against the hull. People begin to jump into the water. Among them is Order Chamont with his wife, both in life vests. When Chamont surfaces, his wife is nowhere to be found, and it soon becomes clear that her body will not be recovered. Shortly after, one of the passengers pulls out a gun and threatens the sailors, forcing them to start lowering a lifeboat filled with people. As a result, the lifeboat capsizes and crashes into the hull of the ship, causing some to suffer fatal injuries while others manage to climb back onto the vessel. A new explosion occurs, and the ship tilts so severely that water fills the upper deck. Dwight Harris grabs a purchased life ring and jumps into the water, losing his wedding ring in the process, but he manages to stay afloat and swim away from the sinking Lusitania. 15 minutes after the attack, Captain Turner realizes that the ship is inevitably going to sink. In his life vest, he stands motionless on the bridge, taking no action. Turner accepts the inevitability of disaster and does not resist. Captain Schweiger of the submarine U-20 silently observes the horrific scene. He sees desperate women and children jumping from the sinking ship into the water. Although this does not excuse Schweiger, it is worth noting that the second and third explosions did not result from new torpedoes. Apparently, they were caused by damage to the steam system from the first shell, which then continued to explode. Nevertheless, Walter Schweiger undoubtedly perceives this patrol as a success. Bookseller Laureate grabs his briefcases filled with expensive editions and heads towards one of the lifeboats, where women with children are already seated. However, the sailor is unable to untie the boat. Laureate throws his briefcase into the lifeboat and tries to help free it, but he is unsuccessful. The boat is too close to the bow of the ship, which is already sinking into the water, and at that moment, Laureate realizes the colossal size of the Lusitania. The stern of the vessel rises above the water, hanging in the air, just as it did with the Titanic. Understanding that he cannot untie the boat and that it will be dragged down with the ship, he calls for everyone to jump into the water and does so himself. His illustrated book, worth a small fortune, goes underwater, along with the lifeboat. Nora Bretterton, having taken her daughter from the upper deck, realizes that she will not have time to return for her 3-year-old son in the cabin. She turns to a stranger and asks him to look after the child while she goes downstairs. She struggles to make her way through the crowd on the stairs, reach the cabin, and gather her son. When she climbs back onto the deck, she notices the stranger to whom she left her daughter, but his hands are empty. The girl is nowhere to be found. Less than 20 minutes after the attack, the ship sends out a distress signal. The only comfort for the passengers at that moment is that it is happening during the day, not at night, like with the Titanic. Otherwise, the horror of the scene is difficult to put into words. Sobs and cries of people fill the air. Of several dozen lifeboats, only 6 were successfully launched into the water, and not all of them were filled. Many of those remaining in the water diligently swim away from the sinking vessel, fearing that the giant will begin to pull everything on the surface down with it. Less than 25 minutes after the attack, the Lusitania completely sinks beneath the water, and soon silence reigns over the surface, broken only by the quiet moans of the survivors. The British Admiralty receives a distress signal from the Lusitania. In the nearby Irish port of Queenstown, there is a new warship of the British fleet that could reach the disaster site in just an hour. However, it is forbidden to set out for assistance due to an experience involving one of the German submarines. It had sunk a British vessel, and another was attacked when it came to help. As a result, the command decides not to send troop ships immediately to assist vessels attacked by submarines. If help had arrived at the disaster site within an hour, the number of survivors could have significantly increased. However, the reality is that they will have to wait more than 3 hours. During this time, most people remain in the water among the debris and bodies. In clear weather, they can even see the outlines of the Irish shore, but it is impossible to swim there on their own. The air temperature is around 12 °C, which is not critical, but hypothermia still poses a threat even in such conditions, and not everyone will be able to endure hours in the water. The first rescue ship arrives around 6 o'clock in the evening. The rescued bookseller laureate, having boarded the ship, meets other survivors, including developer Hamont, who finds himself alone without his wife. Soon, several more rescue vessels join them to help gather all the survivors and the bodies of the deceased floating on the surface. The passengers of the Lusitania are taken to the nearest Irish port, but out of nearly 2,000 people, only 764 survive. In the chaos, some passengers who were thought to be dead turn out to be alive, but the opposite also occurs. Sailor Morton, who was rescuing a lifeboat, miraculously survives. Among the victims is 15-year-old Gwendolyn Allen, who had been assisting him in this task. Nora Brederton and her son survive, but the body of her daughter, which she entrusted to a stranger, is never found. Additionally, the bodies of more than 600 passengers disappear, including the famous heir Alfred Vanderbilt. Many families of the victims never learn the truth about the fate of their loved ones. Captain William Turner barely managed to escape when he was pulled from the water by sailors who arrived to help 3 hours later, thanks to his life jacket. Throughout that time, he watched as seagulls pecked at the bodies of the deceased, and since then, he has hated those birds. Turner becomes a scapegoat for the British Admiralty, one of the leaders of which, at that time, is Winston Churchill. These accusations serve as an attempt by the Admiralty to clear its reputation, as intercepted messages had already informed their personnel about submarine U-20 and its approximate coordinates, but they did not relay this information to the captain of the Lusitania until the last moment. Although Turner changed course at the last moment and was moving slower than he could have, these decisions were not mistakes considering the information available to the captain. And due to the actions of the Admiralty, that information was not provided. The British naval authorities, having information about a potential threat, did not provide military escort for the liner and did not direct it along a safer route. Turner's innocence was confirmed by a special commission investigating the disaster. Ultimately, the sinking of the Lusitania was the result of many minor factors. If the ship had not been delayed due to passenger transfers, if the Lusitania had not been cutting costs and had been moving faster, if the fog had not lifted on that fateful day of May 7th, or if submarine Captain Schweiger had not decided to return earlier than planned. Even a slight change in the trajectory of the torpedo could have prevented the explosions. Any one of these factors, altered in even a single aspect, would likely have saved the lives of the passengers. At the end of 1915, Captain William Turner resumed command of the company's vessels, but despite the exonerating conclusion of the Lusitania Commission, he no longer commanded large ships, and his new vessels were quite small. A year and a half later, in the Mediterranean Sea, a ship under his command was attacked by a German submarine, resulting in the deaths of 150 sailors. But Turner survived once again. 6 years after the sinking of the Lusitania, he retired. His son continued the family business and commanded a ship at the beginning of World War II, but was killed in an attack by a German submarine. Captain Walter Schweiger, responsible for the sinking of the Lusitania, was awarded and given command of one of the most modern submarines, larger than U-20 and capable of carrying more torpedoes. In 1917, while on patrol, the submarine struck a naval mine and was blown up. All crew members, including Schweiger, perished.